What's going on, guys? Over here, and welcome back to another Let's Talk F1 2017 video. This one for the Force India VJM10, the 2017 Force India Challenger, a challenger that they've said they've been working on since May of 2016. I mean, we heard in preseason testing last year that they had already started, rough, work on it, and then they've confirmed today that they've been working on this car actively since May. So a lot of development's gone into this car, and Force India came out with a lot of fighting talk about this year's car, especially after yesterday with Renault's press conference, one of them saying that they think smaller teams like Force India may fall behind just because of the arms race of the new 2017 regulations, the amount of money and kind of development you have to put into these new cars to meet the new regulations and to develop the car. But they came out a lot of fighting talk. But let me know what you think about the actual car look aesthetically. Obviously, it's very polarizing. There's a lot of split opinions about the Force India. I've seen some people say they do like it, and I think the majority say what the hell is going on here with the crazy amount of silver. I think that's the kind of one word I said when it got launched, just silver everywhere. And the kind of most notable things being the huge shark fin on the engine cover, and obviously the new nose that is still actually the nostril nose, but the way they've done the coloring for the carbon fiber and the paint makes it look just a lot like what we had in 2014. It almost looks like a Toro Rosso nose from 2014, just really elongated. But we'll get to that very, very soon. But you can see on this first picture now, from the front end, the kind of things to pick out from this. Well, number one, the air intake on the top. That's actually a lot like pretty much nearly like a copy of Mercedes' engine intake from last year. Now, that's because Force India have said Mercedes' power unit has been over-projected, as in, like, they think they'll get more power than they've planned, and so that needs more air to cool it. So they've kind of copied Mercedes style. Obviously, Mercedes opted for this huge cooler on the top of their 2016 Challenger, because in 2015, obviously, they had a few issues where they had to be a bit minimal on the engine sometimes, and they wanted to go for more reliability in 2016. And so in 2017, when Mercedes have gone to Force India, and obviously there are other customer teams and have said, our power unit's going to be delivering more than we told you to start off with, they've decided to build a bigger cooler in there. So it's very much like the Mercedes one last year. I'm guessing because of this, I'm guessing the Mercedes one that will launch tomorrow will probably have like a similar sort of thing. It may even be a little bit larger. I'm not too sure. We'll see tomorrow. But as for the Force India, getting towards the kind of front end, the actual front end, the front wing. Noted just some of the detailings, very nice complex front wing on the Force India on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, more importantly, I've noted that whole tunnel arching thing that I told you guys about in yesterday's video, the Renault video, that a lot of teams are going for this now, and you're going to see, unless you're Sauber, probably a lot of teams are going to go for this arching way, because Mercedes first brought this in, they were the first ones to develop this idea, and it really is just such a helpful tool to try and smoothen the air coming off the tyre, because you have separated flow coming off the sidewall of the tyre, and then also a lot of arch vortexes coming off the actual wake of the tyre, so that's all in aid of smoothing up that flow. If we move to the actual nose that I mentioned, I've highlighted it, you can see where the actual nostril part is. I've sort of tried to, you can't really see it in the picture because of the shading, but there's basically a tiny small kind of slot gap, which actually makes it a nostril rather than just a weird, like, deep hole in the nose. So it is a fully kind of complete through nostril that allows air to pass straight through, and they've made it a lot more aggressive and actually shallower and higher up into the chassis compared to last year's car. So that's why, because of the way they've colored it as well, they've colored the bottom part with carbon, well, they've not colored it, they've just left it as carbon fiber. And when you just kind of look at it, and when you'll probably see it racing around, it'll probably just look like a 2014 style nose, even though it still technically is that, well, not technically, it is that nostril nose. It's just the way they've kind of decided to color that through. But they've gone with that same concept again. Obviously, they're the only team to go for this nostril concept. And as I mentioned with the Renault car and the Renault nose, when F1 teams pick the nose they're going for, it also depends on what their philosophy is for the rest of the car. Like, a lot of this air going through the nostrils will then be fed straight into winglets that go underneath the car. Force India have two winglets straight after the nostril underneath the car that actually have lots of different slot gaps in, about 10 of them, I think it was. So a very complex winglet that they want to directly get air to via this nostril, whereas other teams may not go for that. You might be wondering why Mercedes maybe is the only team that goes for that very small nose. It's because that's their philosophy. One, they've got that nose set up in a way where it takes air underneath, and they've got like a pregnancy bump underneath that nose from last year, and that's their philosophy. And also, because you've got a smaller nose at the front, there's more air going either side towards the barge boards, which obviously Mercedes had quite complex barge boards even for last year. But that's just why different teams go for different noses. There's different philosophies, and it's not as simple simple a case of, oh, can we just slap a Mercedes nose onto the Force India nose and it'll work, just as it did. You know, there's a whole philosophy of getting all the air to the rear end, you know, around the sides of the barge board. So that's why Force India probably stuck with it. They've had this, you know, as a fundamental sort of design basis pretty much for, like, you know, since they introduced it. I think it was in 2014, wasn't it, in the B-Spec car. So anyway, moving a little bit further upwards, you see I've highlighted this area, which is a very odd bump at the top of the chassis. Very, very odd bump. Now, I would assume that is just there to cover up and hide a pretty nice looking S-duct, like a chunky S-duct. We saw last year the Force India ran quite a hefty S-duct, like it was very, very apparent, whereas you had cars like Mercedes having a bit more of a subtle S-duct. Now, Mercedes did the same thing last year. They hid their S-duct at launch, and they only opened up the panel for the S-duct around the second test. So maybe Force India want to do this for some reason. Maybe they've designed it in a different way that they think they've got an advantage there. I'm just going to cut this in after I recorded this video quite harshly, but there's been an update to what this bump might be from the press. When talking to Force India, they're talking about perhaps the potential of putting in this active suspension that Ferrari and Mercedes in particular have been arguing over the winter. If you missed it, there was a story that Ferrari especially put in an argument. I think they put in a formal letter and like a complaint and a clarification about a ruling of a type of active suspension, but not like properly active, just a sort of clever way of the suspension doing it by itself, of it shifting and helping the balance of the car. Almost like if you remember back in 2014, there was that ban on the active sort of suspension from the front to the rear that Mercedes were running, the Frick suspension, I think it was called, if I remember correctly. And it's almost like the same sort of argument they're having over a different type of system for the front suspension, where it helps balance itself and is very clever. But Ferrari have tried to clarify and almost ban it for other teams not to get an advantage over it. And Force India now, it seems like from what reports are saying, that's why that bump is there, because they're not too sure yet, and they may want to introduce that. So maybe that's why the suspension arm goes so ridiculously high on the chassis. So that could be a possibility. But that's something I thought I'd cut in after I finished recording this video. Literally just finished recording it, then saw my timeline that a new report come out about that. Because otherwise it really is just like a very odd taking the chassis at the top to the highest maximum height and then drooping it down like a 2014 style kind of nose, or even like a 2012 sort of the step nose, but a little bit less dramatic. But I think that's what that bump is, and you'll see in later pictures from the side view, you can see like the panel line for the panel, like the vanity panel they've got over it. So it's almost like that will be entirely removable, and they'll have a nice kind of smoothened out S-duct region underneath that panel. But that's just, you know, my guess and my thoughts on it. Maybe they are going to keep the bump. If they do, I'd be interested to know if there's any real reason for it, because really all that's actually doing is making the air become unattached, because the air is abruptly being chucked up as soon as it hits that bump, so it'll just detach the air. And as I mentioned in the Renault video, that's the reason why you have an S-duct, because you're injecting fresh air on the top of that chassis that encourages mixing on the very top of the chassis, allows all the air to stay attached rather than just get chucked up and separated. If we move then to the right-hand side, the barge board, you can see it from this angle. You can't see it very much. There's a better angle from the side view, but you can see the different winglets right in front of the actual barge board. Again, a huge barge board. Again, they've extended it forward and used all that extra space they can, and you've got a nice little winglet coming off the brake duct as well to also affect flow on that side, because obviously that will help it to the more far side of the side pod. If I move it on to that said side view here, you can see really quite closely that detailing on the barge board. You can just see straight away also by the VJM10 how much forward the floor is actually extending out, like a L shape on the floor is extending out to meet the barge board. Now, that area, literally the corner of that floor and barge board where the VJM10 is, that is the kind of max box the engineers can work with, essentially. Before, the box was a lot smaller, so teams couldn't bring the floor that far, couldn't bring the barge board that much forward. So that's a big reason from the 2017 regulations why you're seeing that pattern now. very interestingly, very different to the Renault style in terms of the upright. You can see right by the Sahara on the side pod, they've gone for the upright that kind of meets halfway to the side pod. They haven't gone for the full extension downwards. So that's something some reporters have noticed and noted. Just nice to see some variety between teams. There's actually quite a big variety between Sauber, Renault, and Force India so far on how they've done this, on how they've done the barge boards, how they've done the uprights. You know, we saw Sauber with probably the most simplest barge board, but again quite large, but just hefty. We saw Renault with a few more slats in their barge board, but also quite high in kind of like a square-like shape at the very front of the barge board. And then Force India have gone for something where I feel like it's more of a kind of barge board that a lot of teams would lean towards. A slotted barge board that allows for drag reduction because all the air is going through those slot gaps, but then they've got that double element because they've got that tinier little winglet on in front of the barge board. And then finally, you can see I've circled the little wheel nut on the front wheel because, again, Force India, they ran it last year. I think they might have ran it in 2015 as well, but a blown wheel nut. So the blown wheel nut essentially means any air that's going to the brake duct, the brake duct is split into a few different sections, and one of those sections in the brake duct for the front brakes will not even go to the brakes to cool them. They'll go straight through the wheel cavity into this blown wheel nut, and the air will pass straight out this wheel nut, and that air is going to travel straight away. Obviously, you've got a lot of free stream air coming at the car from the side. This air getting squirted out of the wheel nut is basically going to get hit with all this free stream air being taken, and it's going to basically go all the way towards the side pod and help smoothen that flow out. Because obviously, if you imagine flow coming sideways from off the barge board from the very front of the side pod where the inlets are on the side pod, that sideways air is then going to get smoothened out and helped out by the wheel nut. Also imagine you've, again, as I mentioned in the Renault video, you've got those separations in flow of the wheel itself. You've got these arch-shaped vortexes coming off the wheel wake. That wheel nut flow coming straight off, a lot smoother than the wake off the wheel, is going to, again, help smoothen that. And that's been, it's not a new concept. It's been there for quite a while, quite some time. A lot of teams use it. Some teams opted to use it, and then they eventually actually stop it, because sometimes they're going to have some downsides to it. But, generally for Force India, they've thought it's a benefit because they've been running it for at least, I think, 3 years. Might even be 4, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it might be even 4. If we move to the rear of the car, Force India's rear wing, a little bit more aggressive on the actual leading edge of the end plate. It actually slants a lot more back than I've seen Renault and Sauber's lean back. But you've got the slot gaps on the very top of the end plate. Something to kind of note that I maybe didn't note before, but it's kind of a given thing now. But Toro Rosso were the ones to kind of introduce this whole slot gap in the rear wing that doesn't actually completely become a slot. It's like an open-ended slot gap, you can see, because it's almost like it's floating with like just a tiny little bit of metal holding it in place between the 4 different slots. So that has been taken to an extreme by teams like Toro Rosso. Mercedes even took it to a bit of an extreme where the entire, especially Toro Rosso, the entire front part, the entire upper part of the rear wing became a slot gap last year for Toro Rosso's rear wing. But that's Force India's take on it with the kink as well. You can see that's from the 2017 regulations, obviously. And then you can see the little washed slots at the very bottom of the rear wing, and that's to take air down to the diffuser to make it work a bit more efficiently. But then let's talk about that fin. Huge Force India fin, and getting away from aerodynamics, because I've talked about the aerodynamics of fins before. Let's just talk about the aesthetics of the fin, because a lot of people are like, what on earth is that fin? So let me know what you think. It is rather large. It is probably the biggest one we've seen so far. It's not very sculpted. It's just literally a square fin, a rectangle fin, unlike the Renault where they kind of slightly made a shape out of it. The same with Sauber. So I think I saw one tweet on my timeline that's almost like a merge of like an LMP1 car fin on the Force India car. So quite a huge one. I feel like they need to maybe put some sponsors on just to make it look like a little bit prettier, or just change the colour up. But yeah, very outstanding fin. You can't miss it basically on this car. So I guess that's going to be a polarising sort of opinion for a lot of people on what the car looks like. But we've also got some floor detailing actually. If you just look towards the front of the rear tyre, you can see you've got little slot gaps, and then you've got an upright also right close to that gap between where the rear tyre and the rear wing start to meet. You've got that gap that I talked about in the Renault video yesterday, and you can see that upright is literally positioned perfectly for that gap to try and make a vacuum seal to make the diffuser work better. But you've got squirt slots, streaks on the floor at the very edge, so some nice detailing there, and a really nice Coke bottle shape from Force India. They've tried to package it really quite tight. As I mentioned in the Renault video, you can see the difference. If you go back to that video and compare the two rear ends, you can see what I meant by, other teams may have a better way to package the rear end a lot more efficiently and a lot more tightly packed, because obviously the tighter you can get that Coke bottle shape, the nicer and more efficient it is for all the air to go and flow through that part of the car, because the flow will attach to that curved surface very nicely and get fed straight into that area where you're working the diffuser, you're working the rear wing as well. So Force India, really nice packaging there. But I think that pretty much covers most of the kind of major interesting details. No vortex generators on the Force India, unlike the Renault. A lot like the Sauber car, with the upright just coming straight over the side pod. Sometimes it may be a little preference, maybe, but also it's something also I mentioned is not the kind of most, obviously, the most important thing to develop straight away in the car. Vortex generators are flow control devices, so they probably come a little bit later compared to other parts of the car. But yeah, that's the Force India. Very polarizing car, very interesting car, actually, if you look at the details of it. But, aesthetics-wise, yeah, it's going to be a bit like Marmite, I think. You're either going to like it or you're really not going to like it. I think the majority are in that kind of second category, but let me know what you think of the car. But that is the Force India, piloted by Perez and Ocon. Should be an exciting pairing, and I hope for the sake of Force India that they prove Renault wrong on their words about them falling behind because they don't have enough money compared to Renault. Because Force India, obviously fourth in the Constructors, it'd be great to see them still continue like that, but also I have my doubts. I don't think they'll fall behind just as much as Renault think, but I think they may struggle a little bit here and there in the season, depending on when other teams bring upgrades. But as a whole, Force India's always been quite clever with their money, so let's hope they can just do a pretty damn solid job again and try and fight for that fourth place again. That would be quite kind of nice, especially for Ocon being the new driver in Force India for his first full year. But anyway, if you have enjoyed the video, hit that like button. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. And you're around here, then do subscribe for weekly F1 content. Obviously, I'm going to try my best to bring analysis videos of all the cars launching this week. So tomorrow is the big one, Mercedes, the reigning world champions. So I look forward to that one. That may be later in the day. That may be more of an evening video, by the way, because I think I'm out in the afternoon. So depending on when the car launches, that video may be a little bit later tomorrow evening. But yeah, that's been the Force India. Hope you have enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.